a book arrives seemingly out of nowhere that speaks to our moment in a language that's both intimate and universal. In what it tells us and in the way it says it, in the stories it offers, as well as in the cadences of its sentences, Douglas Penick's book both braces and calms. It incites and it consoles. The Age of Waiting is the book we need to help us breathe more deeply and see more clearly in a time as fraught as ours. Now, the business of bringing a book to the public, of publishing, is itself a perfect example of universal interdependence. And so before introducing our moderator, Jess Skylson, and moving on to the main event, I'd like to thank a few of the many people working behind the scenes at Arrowsmith and at Tricycle to bring you this book in today's conversation. In particular, I'd like to thank our social media team, Rashona Michael, Laura Stekowick, Cherish Collins, and Rhea Amin for all their help in promoting today's event, and a special thanks to James Shaheen and Tricycle. And particularly, I'd like to thank our managing editor, Ezra Fox, who not only designed the book, but is also behind the scenes today managing this webinar. To everyone at Arrowsmith and Tricycle, a bow. But the best way to show your appreciation, of course, is by purchasing the book directly from Arrowsmith, and we'll post a link in the chat which will allow you to do that. I know that some of you are viewing this from what we used to call abroad. For queries about international orders, please write us at the email that's also posted in the chat. Today's conversation will be moderated by poet and Arrowsmith associate Jess Skylson. An ordained lay member of the Order of Interbeing, Jess is a former aerospace and mechanical engineer who began writing poetry after being diagnosed with stage 4 cancer at the age of 39. They are now a student in the UMass Boston MFA program and interning with Arrowsmith Press. Their poems have been selected as finalists for the Tor House and Yamasi Poetry Prizes and have been published in Evocations, Nixie's Mate Review, The Under Review, and Oberon Poetry Magazine. Now let me turn things over to them. Jess?
Thank you so much, Askold. It's truly an honor to be here and to have the opportunity to moderate this discussion. I'd like to introduce everybody to the author of The Age of Waiting, Douglas J. Penick, and James Shaheen, the editor of Tricycle, who will be in conversation today about topics related to the book. Douglas J. Penick has published novels on the Third Ming Emperor, Journey of the North Star, and about spiritual searchers, Dreamers and Their Shadows, as well as his and Charles Ray's translation of Pascal Quignard's A Terence in Rome. Shorter works appeared in Agni, Chicago Quarterly, Cahiers de Learn, New England Quarterly, Kyoto Journal, Tricycle, Utni Reader, and many others. James Shaheen sits on the board of Himalayan Art Resources and is the editor and publisher of Tricycle, the Buddhist Review, an independent quarterly magazine that presents Buddhist wisdom and practices from a number of traditions to a Western audience. James began his Buddhist practice in the mid-1990s, studying with teachers from a number of Buddhist traditions. He is particularly interested in Buddhism's growth in the West and its applicability to Western politics, culture, and everyday life. Now I'd like to welcome Douglas to read a portion of his new book, The Age of Waiting, to everyone. Thank you, Douglas.
Hello, can you hear me? No, probably not. There we go. Thank you all for coming. I wish I could see you, you know. Arrowsmith Press has shown an amazing amount of generosity and skill in making this book possible. And of course, it's people, in this case, Askold Melnichuk, who is, as he modestly doesn't say, also a superb novelist, as well as a wonderful teacher and much very influential, and also obviously the person who has started and nourished and made Arrowsmith Press as interesting and insightful offerer of poetry and essays. Anyhow, so you should take a look if you haven't ever seen their things before. Ezra Fox and Jess have also worked very hard to make all of this possible, and it's really terrific. And it's been a wonderful association. Similarly, the content of the book would really not exist without Tricycle. And James and particularly his former managing editor, Emma Varvaloucas. These things were not like the things I did, turned out to be not very much like things that other people were doing. And they made it possible for this to happen. But they've also made a journal that is not just about how to or the easier sense of Buddhist life or Buddhist possibilities. So I wouldn't be here without them. And that also includes their editors there, Andrew Cooper, Matt Abrams, and Gabrielle Lefferts. Additionally, and I'm very indebted to Emilio Ambas and the Leaf Foundation for their kind and generous support of this book. And actually other things too, they're wonderful. Okay, this book, The Age of Waiting, is an assemblage of fragments, things ebbing and flowing in our inner life as we face the atmosphere as well as the facts of global environmental collapse. I hope it's somewhat like a garden where there are things placed and you wander through, but then you can turn and the arrangement of the things looks different and or speaks to you in a different way, in ways that I actually have no idea myself how that will turn out. So that was really my hope in this. The section I'm going to read now, I'm going to sort of flip around, but it will begin with a section on path. And as you may know, when the Buddha was a prince, he was kept sequestered from all the hardships and difficulties of the world. And his father hoped that he could be seduced into remaining a king or becoming one. But his curiosity overcame that, and he sneaked out on 4 occasions. And on those occasions, he famously encountered sickness, old age, death. And in the part I'm going to begin here is the path. So that not only is our life circumscribed by sickness, old age, and death, there are possibilities within that. So he discovered that by meeting a yogi or spiritual seeker. Anyhow, so let's switch around here. Okay, this is a path. It is said that finally Prince Siddhartha could not divert his mind from the imminence of old age, sickness, and death. There was no one to alleviate his distress. Claustrophobia engulfed him. Again he left the palace, but this time he went alone and on foot. As sunset fell, travelers disappeared from the roads. Merchants closed their shops. Farmers withdrew into their dwellings. The air grew cool. Birds sang their lullabies before hiding in the trees, and in the deepening night, the world and its great variety of life dissolved in darkness. Prince Siddhartha wandered through the shadows of farms and forests. Animals rustled in the underbrush. Monkeys moved through the upper branches of the trees. He heard men and women sighing in their sleep, moving restlessly in dream. He heard children cry out and old people groan. He felt time and decay and death moving like wind across the earth. The prince sighed and suddenly felt exhausted. The sun began to rise. He watched as slowly the shapes and colors of the world began to separate themselves from darkness. Birds again sang, cattle mooed, and water buffalo roared. Men and women emerged from their dwellings and resumed their labors. Why, thought Prince Siddhartha, why this endless struggling? He sat beside the road in the shadow of a plane tree and wept. After some time, a beggar in tattered robes, carrying a gourd and walking with a staff, approached him. The man was young but emaciated. His eyes were bright and alert. He looked at the prince with detached curiosity, but said nothing. Finally, the prince grew impatient. "Who are you?" he asked. "Where are you going?" "Young lord," the beggar replied, "my name is not important, since I do not seek companionship. I move from place to place, but I'm not going anywhere." The prince was struck by the man's calm and asked, "Surely you have a family and once lived somewhere. How did you come to adopt this way of life?" The young man took some time to answer. "As you well know, my lord, everything alive will soon disintegrate and die. Pain does not cease. We are imprisoned here. I renounced worldly goals and set out to see what, if anything, continues." The prince was deeply impressed by the man's simplicity. He asked, "And then, sir, what have you found?" "My lord, nothing endures, but mind never ceases seeking form." Siddhartha reflected on this. He hesitated, then asked, "Is there a path beyond that?" The beggar looked at the prince. Time stopped. He heard the clatter of wings as a flock of blackbirds took to the air. He smelled the smoke of a wood fire. There was nothing to resist. Then the prince looked up. The young beggar had disappeared in the morning mist. It was a day later when Prince Siddhartha returned to the palace. He went directly to see his father, the king. He bowed. "Great king, merciful father, please grant the request I must make. I am determined to leave the palace. For the sake of all beings, I must find the path that leads to freedom from the world of birth and death." "Why do you think you can find something no one yet has ever found?" the king asked sadly. Prince Siddhartha could not answer. He prostrated 3 times to his weeping father and left. As he passed beneath the shadow of the great stone lintel of the palace gate, he paused. A gap opened before him. His past was behind. He had no idea where his next footstep would lead or what he would become. My friend Tom had a stroke. He found himself imprisoned in his mind. He was unable to speak. He knew the words and how to order them. He had forgotten nothing, but his body and all the physical world had become hard, bright, and solid. He was encased in a seamless continuum of things. Words, thoughts, feelings could not be inserted anywhere between them. A bank of purple clouds against the pale blue-gray above the mountains. Darker with feathered borders descending. Perhaps rain is to come. Perhaps it is falling deep in the mountains. Moment in its own frame of reference, not ours. Its sky mind does not answer our questions or speak to our solitude. Its cloud thought does not articulate need or time. Moment. The lover turns her back, her long, beautiful spine, pale, soft skin. She puts on her robe and leaves the room. Moment. I dreamed I I am hurtling through dimensions I cannot comprehend. I am burnt and frozen, squeezed, distended. Things are pushed into being and pulled out. There's no stopping of the intensity, the claustrophobia, pain, and the intermittent brightness of a shimmering, vast expanse. Gap. On and on, forgetting now, remembering that moment when you first came up the escalator in a red dress. Such beauty, such terror, such intensity, such expanses of dissolving boundaries. I am being devoured. I am in a whirlwind. I will not emerge as the one I once knew. Yeah. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you, Douglas.
Thank you.
One of the things that I found that I truly loved about your book is how I kept returning and reading different sections and passages again and again. I would stop to ponder them, then return to them, and then move on. And so I really find that the book is not one that you read cover to cover, but just as you have read a passage here, this is how I experienced the book, taking time to slowly absorb the words that you've shared with us. And I also found the title quite intriguing, The Age of Waiting. It leads, of course, to the question, what are we waiting for? So I'm wondering if you and James could speak a little bit about this, and perhaps the inspiration for the book, perhaps let us in a little bit on the conversation you had that led you to write this.
Is it me? You're not going to say anything about this.
Well, I can.
Yes, it's. I actually put a little bit of this in the book itself. That it was actually on the last presidential election. You remember we had lunch,
Right.
with.
We were all shell-shocked.
Emma, yeah, well, and I had already thought about this, but I said that I wanted to write about the end of the world. And I asked Emma, Emma's what, about 34? Something.
Well, she was in her late 20s.
Late 20s at that time.
Yes.
I said, what do people of your generation, how are you sensing what we're facing here? And she said two things. She said, what was it? It wasn't anxiety. It was a kind of terror and a kind of lack of model. Those two things. And that got me going, you know. But it's always kind of complicated. It's how things happen. Because when I thought about the lack of model, I urged her to interview Jetsun Kushla, who is a woman, Rinpoche, who lives in Vancouver, who's a fabulous person and very unusual. But that never happened. But I did the two things on those Buryat lamas. And I had only, I'm actually as proud of that as anything that Bidya Dandaran I had read about in 1970 something. So that, you know, a long, long time ago. And it had stayed in my mind, and that I got a chance to just perpetuate his name was great. So that's how that happened. And so we all sort of, so those were the models, and the models were him and his predecessor. And of course, in a way, they both failed, or they both got killed. But his predecessor succeeded for a year, and Dandaran was in the prison camps and adapted his Buddhist teaching exactly to the situation of the people there.
Right. These are two Buryat leaders in the Far East, and they ran afoul of the Soviets like just about anyone with sense did. Right. You know, Douglas, I just want to say one thing. Many of these pieces were written at different times, and I had read several of them. But what was really surprising to me when I read the book is how unified they were. You've been thinking a long time about certain themes that really all come together quite beautifully in the book. But like Jess asked, what are we waiting for in this age of waiting?
I don't know if it's a thing. As I thought about it, you know, it's not Godot, it's not the ice cream man, you know, whatever the things one waits for in that specific sense. But there's a sense of waiting. And in one way, I thought, you know, you could actually say that meditation practice is waiting. You sit and you're attentive to what happens. And you don't have a particular idea. So I didn't have this idea when I picked the title. I think I just sort of, I don't know how it happened really. But
I'm sorry, go ahead.
So it's a sense that we are waiting, we are attentive. And on one hand, there's a sense of apprehension because of the ecological things which seem somewhat insoluble. It doesn't seem like people can step up. I mean, what we've seen through this epidemic has made us realize that actually there are people, a lot of people really just don't want to do it. They can't do it. So that's very, very problematic. So we're waiting to see. But also, I think our waiting, the quality of our waiting has something to do with what will happen.
You mentioned in one of the pieces a man who waits for a visitor who will never arrive. That did sound kind of Godot-ish to me.
Yeah, I forgot I wrote that.
I found it very interesting also that you bring up our current pandemic that we're all experiencing. There were sections of the book where I felt that you were speaking personally to me as you were writing about your experiences with illness and being diagnosed with cancer. And yet now I believe in this current time, there are so many who are experiencing sickness and death. And I wondered if you could speak a little bit, perhaps James also, what role do you see Buddhist practice taking in this global pandemic that we're all undergoing? And also, Douglas, how do you see, I know you wrote the book before the pandemic began, but how do you now, in the midst of it, reflect back on the things that you've written into the book? And I want to let everybody know also, as I'm asking these questions, you yourself may also find yourself having questions as you listen. So please feel free, if you have a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, feel free to add your questions for Douglas and James as well. And at the end of the discussion, we will take some questions from the audience. But I turn it back to you, James and Douglas.
I think, James, you've been on the front lines of this.
Right. Yes. You mean the pandemic? I mean, of course.
The pandemic and how people are relating to it. And you're in touch with so many people and so many kinds of responses that actually I'd like to know what you are thinking here. And
yeah, people, I'm finding people fall into two camps. There are those who, like me, are still working and gainfully employed. And by comparison, it may seem like an inconvenience because there are so many who are in such dire straits. And of course, so many people who are losing people. So in my situation, I'm quite privileged because I'm still working and I'm able to socially distance. But one of the things that when I think of this book, and you do address the pandemic in the afterword, I think the timeliness of the book is it's timely in the way that Buddhism is always timely. We're dealing with impermanence or mortality. That's always timely, and Buddhism always addresses the human condition. It's also timely because, as you mentioned, climate change brings us face to face with our own extinction as a species, or at least unimaginable disruption. And the pandemic feels almost like a harbinger of that. So that's another reason it's timely. And the book deals with these issues, as Askold so nicely said, both on an intimate level and on a universal or global level. And so together, those things make it very timely. But what I'm discovering for me, having spent time in retreat, this isolation is something I was prepared to cope with unwittingly. I hadn't expected, retreat to sort of prepare me for the kind of isolation that I'm experiencing. I mean, so in April in New York, when there were the temporary morgues on the corners, nothing could really have been more of a reminder of what we actually think about and practice for in Buddhism. It doesn't make it any easier, but it provides a framework in which I can understand or experience what's happening. I mean, this is always the truth. It just feels more so now. But the book deals with precisely these issues so beautifully. And what I was really, it's like one long reflection on longing and impermanence and reconciling those. I thought again and again, and I won't go on, I'll let you say something in a moment, Douglas, but I thought of Issa, the great haiku poet, the late 18th, early 19th century, and we all know this, or many of us know this, but it was on my mind the entire time I read the book. And it says, the world of dew, a world of dew it is indeed, and yet. There's also another translation, this dewdrop world is a dewdrop world, and yet. So we have the impermanence and the longing together, and that seemed to me in many ways what the book was about, not only personally, but also looking at our species and contemplating its end. So am I terribly off, Douglas, or is that a fair description of at least one of the themes that runs so beautifully through the book?
Yeah. No, you're completely right. But it wasn't as if I set out to write a book with certain themes. I mean, I worked on these things over the years, and it sort of evolved as having a kind of coherence. And then, particularly with the help of Askold, and then you emphasize those things. A lot of things get fixed up, so that the coherence becomes more evident. In other words, the writing itself was an exploration and a discovery. And I think, again, one of the problems we've been facing with Buddhist practice is that it's often now presented as a solution, where it's simply a means of exploring the insoluble and finding something beautiful in that and sharing it too. I think so. It isn't just about individual discoveries. It's about sharing, finding ways to share what you discover, what each of us discovers.
How do you see the engaged Buddhist movements? I mean, some people think that's redundant to say engaged Buddhism. It's always engaged. But I don't think it's a coincidence that many of the early environmentalists, for instance, were Buddhist. Yeah. Gary Snyder, Joanna Macy, Michael Soule, and then Thich Nhat Hanh used inner being, or what we call interdependence, as the rationale for his engagement. So not being attached and at the same time engaging. I got that sense in the book as well.
Sure. I don't think there's, there are many, people are going to find many ways of going at this. And, some are more congenial, obviously, than others for anybody. So I think I think it's terrific. I think it's an important, maybe underlining of a theme in Buddhism. It's certainly not there.
Right.
I mean, unengaged Buddhism would be odd. Disengaged. Yeah. I mean, it could be. I mean,
Yeah, it could be. I mean, people have different approaches here, and not everybody by any means agrees. But Jess, you did mention at one point when we were preparing for this, what does Buddhism offer to the current crisis we face? And I don't know, I thought the book in many ways, so full of years and years of Buddhist practice, that it did offer me a perspective that at once calmed me and at the same time invited me to participate in life. That's a compliment, Douglas.
I'm amazed. I mean, you participate so much anyhow.
I do. Maybe I should sit more, right?
No, it's great.
definitely agree. I had the same sense from the book that I found, Douglas, as you were bringing up all of these various topics, because as you mentioned, it's a collection of essays. And so as you were bringing up these different topics, there was this sense within the book itself of interbeing, of this interdependence of all of these different ideas. And this then allowed me to take a step back, perhaps, and look at all of the different aspects of my life, even during the pandemic when some aspects have been curtailed, and see the interdependence within my own life and all of the different events that were occurring. And I found also very interesting that you wove poetry, and also you speak of music in the book. And so I wondered also if you could share a little bit about that, because I myself have found that one of the things that have come forward during the pandemic is a reliance more on the arts and music as a way of supporting this sense of isolation.
I think music saved me, you know, when I was young, and my mother took me when I was about 8 to a concert by the great English pianist Dame Myra Hess. And I still remember, my mother said, you get to stay up late, but you can't wiggle. You can't. You have to sit there. And that would seem like an okay trade-off. And I remember Myra Hess. I remember what she played. I remember what she sounded like. Everything. And the depth of her playing and the music, and I became an audience member forever. I think the actual process of listening is we come together usually in a group, which is one thing we miss a lot now. And also there are a lot of concerts that are, most concerts don't exist right now. But you come in and you wait for what's going to happen. And the artist comes out and they give you this architecture in sound, and you share your journey with the whole audience. I mean, even the people falling asleep, or if you're falling asleep. And there's a kind of surrender in that. You know, you don't sit there and say, well, no, I don't know about that. You know, you don't keep up a whole line of subconscious gossip, hopefully. So in that way, it's a great thing, and that we do share it. We always share it. Where even meditation practice, group meditation, you don't actually. I don't know. I never felt that I really was sharing it. You know, I was there, and I didn't want to look too bad. Wiggle too much. The wiggling is just a continuous issue.
You know, the Andi Musik, the one piece that you did for music. I remember when I first read that, it's a very different experience reading it now. I'm not sure why, but seeing all of these again in context, they really run beautifully together. So I'm flattering you again. But what I, as you know, I love your work. That's why we publish it. But you use polyphony as an analogy, really, for the diversity and richness of life. And there was sort of an exhilarating sense I got reading it this time, because it felt like a celebration in a way. Like it was almost a crescendo in the book. I really read it differently in the context of the other pieces. Could you talk a little bit about that? I hope I got it right. I mean, it's
I don't think there's, as I say, I don't really think there's a right in it. But the thing that was the discovery for me in writing that was that I thought, you know, usually when we're sitting there practicing, meditating, we're paying attention to this one stream, and then we think, oops, and then we think, oh, come back. And this one stream. And I thought, why can't we listen to 3 all at the same time? I mean, because that's what we do in music. That's what Western classical music shows us. So that was a big surprise for me. And so that was really the reason to write the whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
You know, not so much just my autobiographical preference. But yeah, so it opened up this idea, maybe we could follow more than one thing. And what is that one thing? I mean, the one thing is fairly illusory. You know, story of my life. I don't know.
And speaking of more than one thing, I mean, even beyond music, of course, we have all the variety of arts. I know, James, you sit on the board of the Himalayan Arts Council, and I'm wondering if you could share a little bit about how you see your Buddhist practice combining with your artistic background as well.
Well, I sit on the board of Himalayan Art Resources here in New York. It was formerly a part of the Rubin Museum and spun off and was supported by the museum. And it has become the one place where you can see have the broadest view of Himalayan art. And, you know, it began with trying to understand this art as art and not simply as, you know, an accoutrement of Buddhist practice. A lot of Westerners simply looked at it like almost like folk art or religious art. But, you know, we're not looking at Michelangelo and saying that's religious art. We're looking at it as art. We're understanding it as an expression of humanity. And so the idea there was to sort of present this art as art. And, you know, eventually the galleries began. It's led by someone named Jeff Watt, who is really the genius behind it all. He worked with Gene Smith, who's thought to have single-handedly saved the Tibetan canon by bringing it to the Library of Congress. And that was really an interesting idea to me, but I was still interested in Buddhist art, you know, in practice. It still could not be separated from it, you know. Not only did I begin to look at it as art or tools for practice or an expression of an entire system like a mandala and the expression of the cosmos, it was also in its own right art. And that was sort of what we wanted to do. Eventually, the auction houses and the galleries began to get a HAR number, a Himalayan Art Resources number. So Jeff really succeeded in bringing that to the art world, allowing it to exist in its own right. But I can't say how it is that the art is made. I'm not a Tibetan Buddhist. Douglas could probably speak more to that. But there is a very specific way in which, say the Kalachakra Tantra is represented, and how it is often like sand mandalas made and then scattered. I mean, I've watched people watch a sand mandala created, and they're horrified when the monks just wish it away, you know, to kind of emphasize or acknowledge or embrace impermanence. But I'm not an art historian. I'm just very supportive of the project. But I don't know, Douglas, how do you see that? I mean, you were a student of Trungpa Rinpoche's, I suppose you still are. How did you relate to the art?
Well, there are slightly two different aspects. I would say that the mandalas and the visual, those things are all visualization aids. So they relate to practice and actually creating that in your own mind. Mm-hmm. Western art, we don't have that so much. That, in fact, in Tibet, people have argued that there isn't Tibetan art, you know, in the sense that we have some sense of, I don't know, freestanding aesthetic experience. They don't. This is all in the service of a practice, of a specific practice, and all those things that are in all those doodads that appear in tankas and stuff, pretty much are mentioned in the texts that they are meant to serve. So that's a different relationship. On the other hand, I think the fundamental aesthetic engagement is, it takes you out of yourself. You enter a world you don't know what it is because you didn't make it. I think a lot about, one of my favorite things is Watteau, his Gersain's shop sign. It was one of the last things he did. So he was famous for those sort of 18th century looking, you know, people looking elegant and and a little sad and that sort of thing. But this was a shop sign. He actually made it for a guy who sold pictures, and it's about, I don't know, 12 feet, maybe 14 feet by 8 feet. It's huge. And it shows the shop. And it shows a woman walking in, and her dress is very long satin, and it kind of hangs behind. There's also a dog. Then you see behind, as she's walking in, there's somebody else over there. She's trying to sell a picture to some, so there are all these things, but it's incredibly rhythmic. And so you're looking at something that really is about selling. And all of a sudden you're brought into this world of, of movement, and it's very sensuous painting, the fabrics and all of this. And
sounds like an article we ran.
It is. I put it in one of your articles. And so we're actually carried away into something else. And we have to, it doesn't really mean anything. You know what I mean? You can't say,
but
I got it.
But don't you think that Himalayan art, I mean, and let's just say more specifically Buddhist art in the Himalayas, don't you think it can actually be understood? I mean, our interest, the way we're going to be presenting it in a series, in a course online with PAR, we'll be explaining to people what exactly these pieces mean in terms of the texts and in terms of practice. That I get. Where I took a little bit of a leap is that I do think it can be looked at with some distance, and maybe not for a Tibetan, I don't know, but it can be looked at as art. As
sure. Well,
yeah.
We do.
Right.
Yeah. I think for a lot of us, yeah. So you still have to respond to the color and the lines and the shapes, and that's a kind of basic thing. And of course, in the teachings that surround that kind of thing, the colors blue, yellow, red also relate to primordial vectors of mind.
Mm-hmm. Right. So to answer your question, Jess, like the way we're looking at it, we're looking at this as we're not looking at it as something separate from practice or teachings. They contain worlds, and as the executive director of PAR will point out, he teaches from around the world, actually pre-pandemic, actually, but it contains like teachings beyond what you could imagine could be contained in a single tanka or canvas. Kala Chakra Tantra, for instance, is infinitely rich in its references, but at the same time, it's a beautiful piece of art.
Thank you both for that. That's really quite intriguing, and it's given me a new perspective on at looking at art within the context of my practice as well. I thought it was interesting, James, how you brought up sand mandalas, and then speaking both of you about how we can look at art both through our practice and also taking a step back and seeing it as art. And I wanted to circle back perhaps to this idea of climate change, which we brought up at the beginning of the discussion, because in some ways, this experience of climate change is like we are living within the sand mandala as it is being wiped away. And we are not able to take that step back. We are a part of that mandala. We too are being wiped away. And I know you speak quite eloquently in the book, Douglas, about the impacts of climate change on a personal as well as global scale. And I wondered if you could speak a little bit more about what drew you to write specifically about that topic within a book that contains such a variety of other topics. It does seem to be, you start the book with this and it seems to be running throughout.
I think I started with it because I couldn't get my mind around it. So it was, I thought we better look at this. And it seemed like it might be worth sharing that exploration. And I think one of the things, this is slightly to go back to something that both of you were bringing up earlier. It challenges in the sense that it brings up our sense of interdependence, complete interdependence in the world. it also challenges the basic mind or the basic mentality with which we have pursued living in this world. And that being, you find the things you want, you process them, you have the byproducts that are good that you want, and you have the garbage, and you leave the garbage behind. And this is the mind that has created our world. Economically, socially, everything. And we have to move towards a larger sense of appreciation and a more complicated sense of, a denser sense of appreciation. And pleasure, I mean, you know. So if it isn't just what you want, maybe it's, you could like it anyhow. You know, we have to go beyond the things we're coming into the auditorium with. I like this, you know. So that was what really, that was a sort of link to all of it, and sort of made me not feel particularly indulgent about indulging in things that weren't strictly speaking on the point. You know, because it's not just about thinking, and it's because a lot of times we use our we have our thinking, we develop our theory of life, or what's good and, you know, what's bad, and then we pour ourselves into the theory of how we can be a better person within that framework, but we sort of dump ourselves in there, and then we don't fit, and, you know, that struggle with concept. Is it more important, I think, that we begin to look around a lot and appreciate everything we possibly can. Which isn't to say you can't resist things that are out and out bad, evil, because there is evil, you know. So that's what, please.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I think I'm done. I was just trying to sputter around and find a way out.
Yeah, I'm going to ask you a question that comes up early in the book. I mean, I remember once Woody Allen said something like, "There's nothing nice about old age," and he was griping and griping in his funny way. But you say early on, what does age have to offer? What does old age more specifically have to offer? And you know, the past year and a half have been quite a year of loss for me. They're one after the next. It's like the 80s all over again, except this has to do with age. I'm wondering, what did you discover in writing all of these pieces, again, that work so beautifully together? What did you discover that age has to offer?
Well, I think, as I said, but I don't mind saying it again in this case. When we're younger, we are trying to reach the world, grab the world. When you're a child, you're trying to find your way in, and then you get there and you try and grab what you want. And it's very appetitive, you know, we want a lot. And then at a certain point in middle age, you want to hang on and sort of shape it so that you can pass it on. But when you're getting old, actually O-L-D, old, the world starts moving away from you. There's nothing you can do about that. Nothing. And but then what happens is you see patterns you never saw before. And you really do. And this is why there's late period Beethoven, late period Bach, Titian, Stravinsky, Shakespeare. Even though he's young, he was quitting. You know, there's a sense of, so in that process, because it's not an avoidable process, there is actually something being given to us. So in that way, I found it very romantic, you know, sort of great. The fact of friends dying is incredibly difficult. It just happened 2 nights ago. We came home, we lived in an apartment building. And there were the ambulances and this and that. And a friend had died, and she was 84. She was wonderfully intelligent. Her name was Susan Merwin. And she would always read everything I did and say what she thought. And Debbie, so she was a wonderful person. But, I mean, 84, it's not tragic. In fact, in some ways, it's better because she was spared the indignities of a prolonged convalescence. But loss is loss, and we cannot get around it. So I think that also has to become part of how we see things. Things become very precious, very, very precious. And there's, that's also part of the appreciation, I think as soon as I was really quite clear on the fact that I would be dead, that I started working a lot harder. And I was much more grateful for all kinds of stuff. And we gave more dinners. We had more fun. Because right, being gloomy is not going to get you through this. I mean, there's nothing going to get you through it. It's like, is Roosevelt Sykes, the blues man, the honey dripper? He had a song that said, if the washing don't get you, then the rinsing will.
Well, you're never gloomy. Maybe
I fake it a lot, Yeah.
But I think what you were giving me, of course, given my diagnosis, I would be quite grateful to reach old age, regardless of how it seemed. But you were making it seem quite delightful, and so I look forward to it all the more. And yet at the same time, it's quite true that it's inescapable. We cannot help it growing old and eventually experiencing sickness and death. And the same can be said of climate change to a certain extent. Scientists are now saying that we have reached the point of no return, so to speak. And that being said, I would like to pivot to some of the audience questions, and we have one on that topic from Richard Jobson asking, he says, not knowing anything about Buddhism is, quote, waiting, a comment on our helplessness to do anything significant to fix climate disaster.
Richard. I didn't think of it that way. Because it was really more an attentive sense of waiting rather than just waiting for the other shoe to drop. And of course, in some way, we can't do anything. But in a way, you could. If you have a life, and you know anybody, you can do something.
Yeah, I think again, there's often a split here among Buddhists, but I think not doing anything is not well. It's an option. That's always an option, but I think doing something without attachment to result is really a skill that I think Buddhism teaches. It's like, you feel compassion, say, and you sometimes can't do anything, but you do what you can without expectation, I think. When I asked Joanna Macy, famous Buddhist environmentalist and many other things, I said, do you feel any hope? And she said, Buddhists don't do hope. I embrace what is. And Douglas's book is very much that way. It's not that you don't do anything. It's just how attached are you going to be to the result? You do what you can. The result is something in the future and beyond our control, I would say. I would encourage people to remain engaged, in other words.
Well, we are, we can always make something a little better for somebody. This is actually quite, we live in a big apartment building. This is 120 units. So every day, some little thing. And some days I'm very aware that I've let somebody down. Some days, and it's just little things, just little things. But it's every day. And so as long as we have some kind of world, we can make things better. And
this notion that we're going to do something and it's going to be all better is something else. But having the humility to take, like Douglas says, little actions or any actions you can.
And you, Douglas, have taken action in the sense of writing this book, which has brought some comfort and insightfulness to me during this time. And
Yes,
go ahead, please.
I was just going to say, Richard invited us to dinner, Debbie. I mean, we had a wonderful time with Louise, and we felt better. We did. It was wonderful. We had a great time.
And like you said, small things. And so there's another question here that relates to this idea of collecting fragments. So this is from Connie Moffat saying, "Hi, Douglas. Beautiful passage. Thank you. I have wondered how you developed your style of collecting fragments, so to speak. Has always reminded me of skandhas, heaps of experience that combine to give the illusion of identity. With love, Connie."
Thank you, Connie. I think I was interested in fragments because I never could figure out anything else. I couldn't figure out I never felt myself to be a coherent entity. You know, I thought I was always improvised and not particularly well improvised. And, you know, then there was stuff that you could turn into stories to tell people and things that you liked. And so it was always just a big pile of junk. But it is beautiful, you know. I love all those things, you know. It's like when you go into they're like weird museums. The weirdest one is the Museum of Jurassic Technology in Los Angeles, which I recommend to everybody to go to. It's in Venice Beach, pretty much, and it's a private museum, and you go in, and it has the kind of seriousness and slightly small scale of private museums that have things like Russian icons and stuff like that. But it doesn't. It has a wall of horns, you know, and it says one of them is a human, from a human, and that's actually true. But then they have a gallery of paintings of all the Russian space dogs, oil paintings, called Perfected Beings. Then they have, you know, so it's all this stuff, and you come out of there and you think your sense of what is official reality has just been made somewhat more porous. It's a beautiful and very special thing that they've done. And people always interviewing them trying to say, well, what's the joke? What's the joke? It's not a joke. It's a really good joke. Yeah. So I think, yeah, I like big museums for the same reason.
And I wonder then, we have an anonymous question here, and so we're speaking about these things that we enjoy, you know, such as weird museums and other things that we appreciate. So the question is, how can we then teach ourselves not to want to hold onto or strangle what we appreciate? And either one of you, James or Douglas, please feel free.
Go ahead, Douglas.
No problem. It won't last. You can do what you want. It won't last. You will. This is not a difficult thing to learn. You are taught this easily, right? Don't you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, I mean, we're talking about attachment, and I don't think I would have a practice if I were an expert.
Yeah.
The things that I owned have claw marks on them. That's just a reality.
I don't think attachment's even bad. You know, you say, well, you don't want to be attached so you won't suffer in the bardo. I think attachment is sort of compassion, and is compassion coming at you. You know, we are attached to these things, and the world is attached to us. And if we try and pretend that those in some way are part of our substance, part of our body, you know, that idea, I don't want to be attached to anything, you think. No dinner for you.
I like how you say, Douglas, that, you know, we are attached to things, but also the world is attached to us, which is quite true. And we don't often think of it going both ways.
Yeah.
And yet at the same time, there is this sense of pulling away from the world as we grow older. And we have another anonymous question. Somebody is asking, as you say, the world starts to move away, so one can see patterns. Do you think that with this awareness, history can be taught in a way that makes it relevant to the climate crisis and all?
Sure. You know, I mean, we learn things, we see things, people tell us the things they see. That's how we learn things, no? I wanted to say also that the world also is compassionate towards us. Usually when people talk about compassion, it's, you know, whether they're being nice to annoying people or something. But actually the world is deeply compassionate to us. It's how come we exist at all and have any pleasure whatsoever, as well as misery and sickness, old age, and death. So we are in a compassionate framework. It's part of the appreciation of all of it, I think.
It's really quite true, is that we are existing in this framework. And I think this idea of compassion and having compassion for ourselves as well as the framework around us in which we exist, the world and other people who alongside us are experiencing suffering. And I'm actually intrigued by one of the questions we have here. Emma has asked, considering this, is what we are waiting for ourselves?
Let's just leave that. That's really nice.
Certainly, certainly. I think perhaps there are some questions that can remain as questions.
Yeah, it's a wonderful, wonderful question. I don't think it needs an answer.
I have another question here from Victoria Bomberry, and she's referring back to something you mentioned about listening to three, and she's curious to learn a little bit more about that.
On YouTube, there is a video and recording of a section of a fugue from Bach's Art of the Fugue. It's a very complicated, super complicated piece, and it's laid out so you can see it.
Mm-hmm.
So if you find a Bach Art of the Fugue, I think it's the mirror fugue. So it's actually written, so it's a mirror of itself all the time. Amazing. But so that would illustrate sort of how far you can extend your ear and your concentration. It's pretty extreme, but beautiful.
These are good questions.
Yeah, they are. They're terrific.
Especially Emma's was good. But of course, I'm biased.
Thank you all very much, those of you who are writing in questions. We are getting quite a number of them. We won't have time to reach all of them, but I think we have time for perhaps one more. And so I'm going to ask here, there's a question saying, I was thinking about what you said about climate change, looked from outside of the rather simplistic lines of good and bad. I was recently at a talk where the speaker spoke of noticing and loving the beauty in nature as a way of protecting it / reacting to it, and even being attached to it in a compassionate way, are perhaps the only ways left now to save it. I was wondering about your thoughts on this.
Well, that's true. I mean, I think that's one way. That's a way we can relate to things. There's a wonderful book by Anna Laubenhaupt Singh, T-S-I-N-G, who is a professor at Santa Cruz, and it's called The Mushroom at the End of the World, and it's about how both a certain kind of mushroom and people who are both the products of and live in completely devastated environments make something happen. And there's a lot of study. You know, if you take her as a beginning, you can find many other people working in these kinds of things of seeing what actually happens. What do people actually do? So the response isn't just, well, it works or it stops. It's a more, it goes on and on. It's a wonderful book. It's beautifully written and it's just terrific. She even has a chapter on the taste of the mushroom, amidst all this economic stuff and all these other things, sociological things. She's an extraordinary person. Yeah, maybe that would be helpful.
She makes an appearance in the book too.
Yeah.
And I wonder, James, if you could speak a little bit to that as well, perhaps from the perspective, you said you had studied with Joanna Macy and this idea of engagement and how we then engage with ourselves and the climate in the midst of this sense of old age, sickness, and death affecting the earth as well as ourselves.
Well, I wasn't a student of Joanna's, but I have followed her work, and I some time ago did a podcast with her, and that's when I asked her about hope. And one of the things that I found really freeing that she said was she's in her 90s. She doesn't regret being alive at all at this point. She just is so eager to see what will happen. She is infinitely curious, you know. It's not that she, more than most anyone, has been engaged on the front lines, but how she has managed to keep her sanity when she's looking at something so complex and overwhelming, so looking so closely at it and being involved with it without wearing out or without losing her interest and curiosity and love of life. So, you know, burnout, despair, these things bring so many of us down. And yet here's this 91, 92-year-old woman who's been working on this for decades, 40, 50 years. She's been thinking about this and she's gone through all sorts of things. But when she said, I embrace what is, and she is understanding the enormity of the problem at the same time staying curious and involved, I just found that very moving. I found it very impressive. So I guess in that sense, I'm a student of hers. I really did listen to her, and it shifted my perspective somewhat. And I think Douglas's book does something similar. I remain engaged and I'm full of interest, despite this world that is so unreliable. There's such imagination both in this book and in Joanna's view after all these decades of watching the situation only worsen, and still she's full of life and delight. Not that she doesn't care, she's engaged still, you know. So that was my experience of her and what I got out of that. And it's something similar in the book. I mean, there's an elegiac tone, but yet it's beautiful, and I remain curious and open.
Well, then you continue to present a wide range of responses to this kind of thing, some of which are more direct, some less so. Mm-hmm. And, you know, so there's actually lots going on. And you bring them to us, and so that's great. And
so does Aerosmith. I forgot to thank Aerosmith. It's fantastic that they've published this book.
Thank you. Yes, certainly. And I wonder now, Douglas, as we're quickly running out of time, unfortunately, because I really truly loved this discussion. I wonder if you perhaps could close with a little bit more of the book.
Funny you should ask. Yes, thank you. This is from the ending. In my early 20s, I lived in New York. It was the late 60s, a time of upheaval, fertility, surprise, unsought intensities, doubt. I did not know how to enter or to become a part of it, or what to enter or be part of. I walked the streets. One bright early summer midday, I was walking in the dappled, fragrant shadow of ginkgo trees lining the street on my right, and the cool marble facades of private mansions to my left. A car honked. A black limousine was parked just ahead. I looked, and the dark rear window slid down. A young woman, very young, her face elaborately made up, peach-colored cheeks, shining dark lips, hair in ringlets, her jade eyes with long eyelashes gazed out at me. I was stunned. I had never seen such allure. She seemed to shimmer slightly. She seemed to be from somewhere else. She stared gravely, waiting. I was paralyzed. Then the window closed back up, and the limo pulled smoothly away. I never knew what I should have done. If I should have done anything. It was a moment whose resonance stayed and drew me on. It was a lyrical sensation shaping my longing, my uncertainty, and how I continued wandering through the city, especially at night. It was a promise of some new search and some new and unimagined intimacy, some new and unimagined world. Seeking does not wane. The persistent intuition that there is something just beyond the limit of the senses, on the far side of the edge of the known, is ever unassuaged and promising and alluring and fearsome. It is the ever-seeking heart. No doubt this is what the sages of long ago meant when they said that the heart or heart-mind is what seeks an object. They who took refuge in forests or desert monasteries, and we with all our electronic gear, cars, and packaged supermarket food are linked. We are all still searching. Oh, we realize this has been going on for a long time. We hadn't noticed or wanted to notice, but now we must. A new world that has not quite shown itself is emerging. In vain, we look for clues. Outside us, we sense that reason, faith in reason, is eroding. Things feel less solid, more strange. We're in this together, says the sign. But we feel, each of us, newly alone. We are adrift and wandering amidst lies and lost certainties. We feel, even in the solitude of our own homes, foreigners. Unmoored, untethered in such a torrent of change, it is easy to forget that this has forever been the world's condition. Now, once again, we must re-examine our life in the world. We must look further into ourselves to find how to proceed. 3,000 years ago, the sages of ancient China sought to depict every moment in the process of change, from creation to destruction. This was in the Book of Changes, the I Ching. It was an extraordinary ambition. The section called The Wanderer focuses on the recognition that one is now in an unfamiliar world, and one must be careful not to take laws and customs for granted, not to believe that one understands situations which are unfamiliar, and not to indulge in unwarranted swings of mood. The wanderer is, quote, clear-minded and cautious, and, quote, succeeds through smallness. Thus, the commentaries say, keeping still and adhering to clarity, success in small things, perseverance brings success to the wanderer. The wanderer dwells in shelter, but has not yet obtained a place. The heart-mind of the wanderer is not at ease. An empty bird's nest burns. At first the wanderer laughs, then laments and weeps. This is now our world. We are part of this and can't separate ourselves from any of it. We must look carefully within ourselves. We can't turn away. As so much is lost, so much that is ancient returns. So much that is new appears. Thank you.
So beautiful, so beautiful. Thank you so much, Douglas, and thank you, James, as well. It has truly been a delight and an honor to share this time with you. And I'd like to thank everybody in our audience who has attended. If you are interested in purchasing The Age of Waiting, it's available on our website, arrowsmithpress.com. And also please note that a recording of this discussion will be emailed to you afterwards. Thank you, everyone, and I wish you all a very peaceful day.
Thank you.